Has a movie ever scared you so much that it actually rewired your brain? And not just your brain, but others too. Can a film spark a social phenomenon where suddenly everyone is scared of the same exact, very specific thing and acts differently in the real world because of it? Maybe there's new neural pathways in your mind instantly created after experiencing that movie. Some horror movies have that power. Ones that shocked you in such a way that it changed how you saw the world around you and even how you interacted with it. Maybe you saw a film and it locked a new fear that you never thought about before. Maybe a scene has ingrained itself in your memory, so now you're hyper aware of certain things that never really seemed concerning until now. Maybe you act differently in particular situations to avoid the potential of something terrible happening, however strange or unlikely.
Nope.
Basically, this horror movie rewrote your mind, altered your brain chemistry. For some people, a scary movie can truly transform how you experience the world, and I can name a few that did this on a large scale. Raise your hand if you've been personally victimized by the logging truck in Final Destination 2. I'm going to talk about a few horror films that famously did this to their audiences, but also to me personally. Are there any movies that come to mind for you? Since I'm only going into a handful of films, let me know in the comments of some other big ones I missed. Also, I thought it'd be cool to look into the psychology and science of it all. Like, how does this happen? Why do certain movies stand out in the way they expertly crawl under your skin and nest themselves in your brain for years or the rest of your life? And what happens when this phenomenon goes even further than convincing you to avoid a truck on the highway by changing lanes? What if the movie is so traumatic that its moviegoers turn into medical patients? Let's start with the horror movie that actually has hard proof that it influenced people's actions, like unintentionally causing humans to hunt innocent wild animals. That movie is Jaws. It was a groundbreaking horror film that instantly became a classic when it was released, and actually had a lasting effect on our society psychologically too. It's not rare nowadays to have a fear of sharks, but before this movie, it really wasn't as common. The film instilled these fears into fresh minds that never considered them that dangerous before. As you probably know, Jaws is about a great white shark that preys on a local beach town, attacking and killing multiple people during the peak summer season. Great directing that focused on the shark's point of view of unsuspecting swimmers, and foreboding, now iconic music helped create a powerfully suspenseful movie that terrorized audiences and caused some viewers to second-guess their future beach vacations. So a little history here: sharks were mostly considered harmless to us humans before the 1960s, but then shark scares off the coasts of the US were blown up by the media, and also apparently literally blown up by the police. At one point, a group of city police in New York, quote, triggered several bursts of machine gun fire aiming into the water, unquote, to show the photographers and civilians that any sharks in the nearby water were taken care of. Which honestly sounds like a scene from a parody movie to me, but also seems very on the nose for how America would deal with something like this. Anyway, soon after, in 1974, Jaws the book was published, and in 1975, the movie was released in theaters. The general public knew very little about sharks, but once the book and film came out, shark attacks were sensationalized even further, and unfortunately, the animals were hunted by fishermen as trophies, which caused their populations to drastically decline. All of a sudden, sharks were being called perfect killing machines and man-eaters. Shark hunting tournaments became a thing because, of course, as humans, we constantly feel the need to prove we are on the top of the food chain. The good news out of all this, though, is that the increased attention on sharks led to more awareness and eventual increase in conservation attempts for their kind. So clearly, this horror movie had an undeniable effect on tons of moviegoers and our society in general. Even 50 years after Jaws came out, we still talk about how scary it is and how terrifying it would be to go face to face with a shark. The concept of what can be out there under all that vast open water is what made for a perfect plot for a memorable horror story. Jaws was powerful enough to make some avoid the beach out of fear, and unintentionally inspired others to hunt these animals, showing how scary movies can really influence people's actions and change how we interact with the world. Okay, so maybe let's say Jaws didn't make you afraid of sharks or the open water, but how do you feel about driving? Still good? What about if you were driving behind one of these? Honestly, when I first came up with this topic of horror films that could alter our brain chemistry in such a tangible way, I was specifically thinking about one movie, Final Destination 2. This film immediately left a strong imprint on my young tween brain when I first watched the first two films in this franchise as a double feature during a sleepover. Of course, I couldn't sleep that night, instead just lying in bed, staring at the dark corners of the room, waiting for the inevitable Rube Goldberg machine of death to get me. So if you don't know, the basic premise of all the movies in this series is death coming after those who have miraculously avoided it. This franchise preys on our fears of everyday accidents and coincidences that could lead to tragedy. All the inciting incidents of each installment revolve around a place or event that many of us are familiar with. Granted, with each sequel, the deaths get a little bit more overly specific and silly, so started to lose what made the original premise so unnerving. In order, we have a plane explosion, a massive car accident, a roller coaster derailment, a car race crash, and a bridge collapse. Now, all these could affect you depending on any existing fears you might have or maybe trigger a new one for you. However, Final Destination 2 had the scene that affected me the most, and based on my experiences with other people who watched this when they were younger, it seems I'm not the only one. Anytime I see one of these vehicles in a video or a picture online, there are people commenting on how they avoid them and how Final Destination 2 essentially traumatized them. The opening sequence with the infamous logging truck wrecked me for life. This truck was the catalyst for many deaths in this scene, since no one could avoid the falling logs on the highway filled with other terrified drivers. If I see one of these trucks on the road, I do not want to be anywhere near it, so I drive around it if I can. Final Destination 2 succeeded in implanting this uniquely specific fear in its viewers by having such a memorable, horrifying event happen in a place that some of us frequent almost every day. Sure, the scene is over the top and ridiculous at times with an excessive amount of explosions. But we can still imagine something like this happening to ourselves. We look at these huge pieces of wood, weighing thousands of pounds, wobbling on a bed of an 18-wheel beast of a machine, strapped down to the truck with some wire and brackets that might as well be string and toothpicks in our eyes. The audience might inherently know that an accident involving one of these trucks and yourself is unlikely, but the odds are never zero. There are no real statistics with this one, since our changed actions are minor compared to the effect Jaws had. But I know based on any mention of these trucks on sites like YouTube or Reddit, and some conversations I've had in real life, some of us have not been the same for the last 20 years. So of course, there are more movies than just Jaws and Final Destination 2 that have this kind of noticeable effect on how their audiences interacted with the world after watching the film. Just to dive into another one really quickly, we have 1960s Psycho. Some women viewers became scared of doing something as simple as taking a shower. Even the actress in the extremely famous shower scene, Janet Leigh, was so traumatized after watching it back that she took baths instead of showers whenever she could. Psycho ingested realism into the horror genre, showing things we've never seen on film before, like a toilet flushing. And all these things made the audience feel vulnerable, like it could have happened to them in real life. And that seems to be the connection between a lot of these films. Something in how they are filmed or the subject matter is so grounded and realistic to us that we feel that exact vulnerability and can imagine ourselves in the victim's shoes. A movie like Final Destination 2 had a minor impact on its viewers, as in sure, I will do what I can to drive around that truck, but it hasn't hindered my ability to drive. Jaws had an even more powerful effect to the point where audiences' actions could be recorded with decreased beach tourism and shark hunting competitions. I didn't mention this earlier, but there was actually a case of a teen girl having night terrors and fits, claiming that sharks were attacking her, to the point of her having to be hospitalized and treated. She was experiencing a severe case of the phenomenon I've been talking about, and there was another film in the 70s that had similar life-changing effects on the community, but with even a scientific study to back it up: The Exorcist. Basically, The Exorcist is about a little girl being possessed by a demon, and her experience with the exorcism that comes after that. Okay, now I know what you might think. This movie isn't exactly realistic in the slightest because it focuses on demonic possession, and the girl's head spins around, and she levitates, and other supernatural things happen. But the thing was, it did seem real to those it affected the most. The Exorcist had such a significant negative impact on some that they had to be professionally treated, and this movie-activated phenomenon had to be scientifically studied. The movie not only scared them, but caused severe anxiety and psychological breaks. This phenomenon was called cinematic neurosis, described as the development of anxiety, somatic responses, dissociation, and even psychotic symptoms after watching a film. In a 1975 study by J.C. Bozzuto, 4 patients were studied as they had been seriously affected by The Exorcist and were experiencing symptoms like insomnia, panic attacks, and intrusive thoughts. All these patients had connections to Christianity, insanity and were vulnerable to the religious trauma that the film induced. So to them, the interaction with a demon or demonic possession was not completely unbelievable. It felt real to them. Bozzuto explained that the movie provided stimuli that broke through any existing psychological barriers that would normally help someone cope with trauma and therefore triggered symptoms. These 4 patients all underwent therapy and improved their conditions, with the neurosis eventually clearing up entirely. This kind of neurosis occurred with other films and has even led to more unfortunate situations, with some committing acts of violence and murder. It is believed that these movies act as a source of trauma to viewers who are particularly susceptible. They relate to the film so much emotionally that it ends up affecting their entire lives. When I thought about this topic, I originally thought about it in a sense of something minor, like my aversion to logging trucks. It seems we can be grateful that the majority of us won't ever experience anything more than this. At worst, we might forgo swimming in the ocean on our next beach trip, or maybe something else more specific to you from a different horror movie that unlocked a new fear. This phenomenon proves that horror movies can be truly powerful, not just for scaring you in the theater or giving you a couple of nightmares the night of. They can really alter your brain chemistry. They can trigger something in your mind that you never knew was there. Honestly, it's a little scary knowing that there's always a possibility of you going into the movie theater and leaving with your life changed forever.